What's up guys, it's Pliskin here today and welcome to another episode of Reality versus Virtuality, a series where we look at a certain aspect of guns and video games and we analyze the real life counterpart of whatever we're talking about. Today we're going to be going over burst rifles, or pistols, or SMGs, generally just the idea of burst fire. But before we do that, I just want to mention very quickly, the last 3 videos I made was like kind of spamming Halo CE playthrough, and I did that because I'm just trying to put my playthrough up there so I can go and talk about Halo Combat Evolved in a full-on review, and then talk about how it's influenced my thoughts on Halo Infinite. So that's why I'm throwing a lot of playthroughs out there. But yeah, with that being said, let's start with the history of burst rifles. The concept originally came from a Costa Rican weapons manufacturer called Breda. The Breda PG was a 4-round burst rifle firing the 7x57mm Mauser round, which was popular in Latin America during the time of its development, which was 1932. This system was truly popularized by Eugene Stoner in the 1960s with the US's adoption of the M16. The idea was to provide inexperienced infantrymen with the capability of maintaining accuracy while still enjoying a higher volume of fire. To this day, the M16A4, which is the most current variant as of 2020, still features the burst mechanic. However, recently many in the US military are starting to change their minds about the burst fire system, and future weapons will either have a semi-automatic or full auto function, as many soldiers complain that the burst mechanic is kind of a master of none, but not a jack of all trades. Many would rather prefer to control the rate of fire themselves with full auto, or stick to semi-auto and manage their shots more accurately. Around the time the M16 and its burst fire mechanic was starting to get really popular, H&K designed the VP70. This is an interesting pistol that allows users to convert it to a triple burst pistol caliber carbine by attaching a stock which gives a fire selector option. The idea was to allow German police officers to carry the VP70 as a standard carry pistol, but then in high tense scenarios where more firepower was needed, they could attach this stock and turn it essentially into a mini rifle using pistol caliber rounds. This never really caught on though, as many Germans in the military as well as the police force found it a lot more practical to either use a pistol or something specifically designed for fully automatic fire rather than sticking in this middle ground. But the VP70 is still a very interesting pistol, so don't be surprised if eventually you see a Pliskin's pick on it. The Russian AN-94 is perhaps the most practical example of a burst fire system. Instead of trying to reach a middle ground between full auto and semi-automatic fire, it aimed to create a deadlier semi-auto performance. This was achieved through having a reciprocating barrel. So basically what would happen is that every time you pulled the trigger, a shot would go out, and as the second shot would be fired in its burst mode, 2-round burst, the barrel would be already traveling back. So you'd only really feel that recoil from that first round. This allows you to get more of a volume of fire and stay accurate. If anything, the AN-94 could be seen as like the true success story with burst fire systems, as the M16 had its issues, the VP70 had its issues because there was still a decent amount of recoil and it felt really hampering. Whereas with the AN-94, it feels pretty much like you're using it on semi-auto, but you're actually getting an extra round out. Fun fact, it's because of this complex reciprocating barrel that the magazine on the AN-94 is canted towards the side instead of coming straight down. This system is complicated and takes up space in the rifle, so that magazine had to be adjusted, and this was part of its downfall, its complexity I mean, in the sense that the Russian military found it a lot more practical to just use the AK-74 platform, because that was a lot simpler, easier to manufacture, cheaper, and easier to teach how to use and maintain. So while the AN-94 is an amazing rifle, specifically because it finally manages to nail that burst mechanic, it's still a very complex system, not suited for military standards. Military standards being whatever's the cheapest and still works the best. So now that we've gone over the origins of burst fire, some of its attempts, both successful, temporarily successful, and its downfalls, whether that's overcomplicated systems or soldiers just preferring full auto to semi-auto, let's talk about the interesting niche that burst fire has kind of carved out for itself in video games. Now, if you've played any video game or watched any other video that talks about weapon balancing in video games, whether that be one of mine, thank you if it was, or someone else's, you'll know that if a weapon has a high rate of fire, it usually doesn't do as much damage as something that has a low rate of fire. This is good because it gives you a reason to pick up a bolt-action rifle over a semi-automatic rifle, because if you were playing a video game and a semi-automatic and a bolt action both do the same amount of damage, there wouldn't be a lot of reasons to pick up that bolt action. So essentially, the slower a weapon is, the more heavy hitting it is to make up for that slowness, and vice versa for quicker weapons. Now, burst fire, like in real life, kind of sits in the middle of a slow firing weapon and a fast firing weapon. It sits in the middle of a run and gun and precision type weapon. And this is really reflected in games. Far Cry 4 is a great example of this. My favorite gun in that game, the FAMAS, is a burst fire weapon, and the way it behaves in Far Cry 4 is very similar to how burst fire weapons behave in other games. It's not going to get you the same amount of damage or range as the M14, and it's not going to get you the same kind of gung-ho, forgiving action as the AK. It sits somewhere in the middle, so for Far Cry 4 specifically, this makes it adept as a stealth weapon, because if you take your time you can really get some decent headshots at decent ranges, but if someone turns the corner and you're right there, you can still spray and take them out. It doesn't really excel at direct combat, but if you plant yourself somewhere where you're hard to find, you can do a lot of damage with the suppressed FAMAS, and that burst fire mechanism really helps it find this role and differentiate itself from the other guns in the game. Halo 3's battle rifle works very similarly in the sense that this is like your headshotting weapon. It's not the assault rifle or SMG where you're charging in up close just trying to do as much damage as possible, but it's not the full-on sniper rifle where you're going to be like capping off enemies with a single headshot. This is kind of like your jack-of-all-trades in-between kind of weapon, and that burst fire mechanic and sound effect, which is brilliant in this game, really helps define that role for it. It really is that in-between kind of gun, which is at the heart of what burst fire is trying to be. So when you use this in Halo 3, you're normally at a mid-range distance, kind of like how you would use the pistol from Halo CE, and you're using this to thin out your enemies' numbers, getting those headshot kills on weaker enemies, killing a couple stronger enemies from afar, and making the situation more so in your favor before you charge in and make yourself vulnerable. Without the 3-round burst feature, this gun would either feel way too much like the sniper, or if it was fully automatic, it wouldn't feel like it suits that kind of mid-range scoped role, you know? So the burst fire mechanic helps justify it within the sandbox and helps it settle into that very niche and unique kind of role. For games that kind of sell themselves on having a whole big wide sandbox of weapons, the burst fire mechanic can serve as a way to differentiate a gun that would otherwise feel very samey to something else. Take Uncharted, for example. It features a burst fire FAL and a burst fire Rafika M9 pistol. Now there's tons of assault rifles in Uncharted that can start to feel samey, so what they tend to do is mix up the rate of fire, and the same thing goes with pistols. Now the M9 Rafika kind of holds that middle ground between something like the 1911 default pistol and a heavy revolver in terms of damage. So it's unique enough to be there, you don't really need it to be there, I'd still call it wasted space, but it's a way to kind of be like, hey, this is kind of different, so be gentle on us, Pliskin. Now, you can also use this to kind of feature a rifle in your game, but not have it fulfill the same role as another rifle, even if it doesn't really make sense. For example, the FAL never really came in a burst fire configuration. However, Uncharted doesn't really give a shit and just puts it in there because, you know what, it fills that niche, and it's really cool to have an iconic weapon like the FAL in your game. So, burst fire within games has a lot of uses within its balancing, whether it justifies a weapon's damage output, or solidifies its stealthy marksman status, or maybe it's just an excuse to include a really cool gun in your game. While burst fire may have way too many drawbacks in real life and video games, it really has its place, at least I feel. What do you guys think? Let me know down below in the comments. If you learned something new or just enjoyed the video, and if you like Metal Gear content, gun content, Halo content, or even Far Cry content, go ahead and subscribe to this channel, because I'm sure I got something you'll like. Anyways, this has been Puskin, over and out.